So some books have a way of reshaping how we see the world. Sometimes we call these life-changing books. Other times, though, we just say that they were important books for us. Maybe we read them at the right time. Maybe they were about some topic that we really cared about. Well, I'm going to share with you today 5 books that are like that for me. These are mostly works of philosophy, though there's a work of fiction at the end, and all of these books, in some way, changed how I see the world. And we're going to start with a book that should be relevant to all of us today because it is about the right to privacy. The right to privacy is one of those topics that I know people care about, but for some reason, professional philosophers and ethicists, even political theorists, haven't spent that much time thinking about privacy and why it matters and why the right to privacy needs to be defended. But a major exception to that is this book by Lowry Presley called The Right to Oblivion. Privacy and the Good Life is the subtitle. Imagine that someone were to come into your room when you're not there. And they look around, maybe they read your journal, but they don't find anything embarrassing. They don't find anything shameful. They just find out some facts about your life, facts that ordinarily you wouldn't mind if people knew. So we're assuming that when they've come into your room and looked around at all your stuff, they haven't hurt you by what they've discovered. That's the sort of case that motivates Presley's concerns about privacy. Because even though we don't feel like we've been harmed or we can't point out exactly how that person has harmed us, we still feel like we've been wronged. Somehow that person did something wrong, and sometimes we even say they violated our right to privacy. But figuring out exactly what the right to privacy is, turns out is more complicated than you would expect. Our laws about privacy are kind of crazy. One of the first examples in this book is an art exhibit. It's a photography exhibit from Arne Svensson. That exhibit was called Neighbors. It's a series of photographs that were taken through people's windows when their curtains were open. So the curtains were open, and so they were in full view if you had a camera or you were just looking in the right direction. But when you look at these photos, they feel too intimate. They feel like we're violating somebody's privacy. And the people who were photographed, they also agreed. Even though Svensson didn't break any laws, he had clearly broken a moral norm. We feel like we deserve privacy. But why do we deserve privacy? That's the question that Presley is trying to answer. He also is concerned with how our views of privacy have changed over time. It turns out that technology has played a huge role in shaping how we think about privacy. One of the first moral panics, you might say, about privacy came with the advent of the Kodak camera. Prior to these sort of point-and-shoot cameras, people had to set up cameras, and it took a really long time, and you had to sit there and wait for your photo to be taken. So we never felt like people were taking our photos without our consent. But when cameras became smaller and they became faster, suddenly everybody could carry a camera around, and whenever you went out into public, your photo could be taken. You didn't even have to directly give consent for that. But of course, things have gotten even worse in that regard when you consider the fact that we have smartphones. Now, everyone carries around a camera, but it also is a video camera, and it has pretty good quality zoom, and it can record you in audio form as well. And on top of that, pretty much every time you go into a public space, you are under surveillance, not just from the people around you who could take your photo at any time, but also the fact that most businesses and even intersections and some public streets have security cameras. Now, if there is a disaster or something terrible happening, our first instinct is to pull out our phone and to start documenting it. And increasingly, we might start to think of privacy not as a right, but as a luxury, maybe something we're not entitled to, and in fact, something that very few of us can ever have. But Presley says that privacy is not a luxury. It really is a right. And he says that it is necessary for living a good life. He's drawing on philosophers like Hannah Arendt, who we'll talk about in just a moment. And he's trying to explore how privacy allows us to be deeper human beings, actually get into the depths of what it means to live a good life. Some human activities can only exist in private, he says, and these aren't activities that are embarrassing or shameful. They're in fact core parts of what make life worth living. One of those, he says, is getting to know yourself. The more that we exist in public, as we live increasingly public lives, and more of what we do is in the public eye, more people know about us, but we actually know ourselves less. And that's one of the great tragedies of losing privacy in our lives. So what makes privacy valuable? Well, the short answer given early in this book is that privacy allows you to control what Presley calls the biographical dimension of your life. In other words, it gives you an element of control over telling your own story. As we are constantly documented or posted about or just seen too much in public, we lose control over narrating our own stories. And if we want to wrestle back some of that control, then we need to restore some of our rights to privacy. I think this is why so many authors or celebrities or artists eventually try to retreat from the public eye, and they go and almost live like hermits. They're just sick of being seen and observed. Privacy has always been a value of mine, which is a little bit odd because, as you can tell if you're watching this video, I make my living making YouTube videos. So I make my living being seen by people. In fact, I make more money if more people see me. And so that's a tension that I've had to live with in my own life. How can I value privacy, but also do what I do for a living? I actually interviewed Presley over on my newsletter. There's a link to that interview down below in case you wanted to watch it, because he and I talked for about an hour about this book. And Presley helped me understand that valuing your privacy doesn't mean you have to fully retreat from the public eye, but there is still a value to privacy, even if you are, in some sense, a public person. And this book also helped me understand what I owe to other people in regards to their privacy. I think about this especially with my kids. So I have a son and I have another kid on the way, and I don't post about them online. I mean, I've just told you that I have them, but I don't really share many details about them, and I never share their photos. I try my best to keep them off the internet. This isn't because I'm afraid of the internet. Again, I'm here, right? But what I'm trying to do is give them an opportunity when they're older to introduce themselves to the world and to tell their own stories. I am protecting their privacy so that they get to make decisions for themselves down the road. The Right to Oblivion is obviously a great work of contemporary philosophy. It's also highly accessible, and I think almost anyone could pick it up and read it. It's a little dry at times, but the topic is gripping enough that you'd be able to muddle through it, even if you don't read a lot of contemporary philosophy. Presley is drawing on a number of philosophers in this book, but one of the philosophers that comes up again and again is Hannah Arendt, and that is in particular this book, The Human Condition. Now, Arendt might be more famous for books like Eichmann in Jerusalem or The Origins of Totalitarianism. My personal favorite book from her is The Life of the Mind, but The Human Condition is not only a famous work by Arendt, but it's a very important work, and it is a book that when I read it, I had to see the world a little bit differently afterward. Arendt thinks that the world is a kind of achievement. The world isn't just this thing that we all live in, it's a thing that we mutually build. But we don't just build the world in return shapes us and changes us. This is what she means by the human condition, actually. Instead of talking about human nature, which she does not want to do, she thinks that discussions of human nature are superfluous or misguided, or at best, you'd never really be able to answer the question of what is human nature. Arendt wants to talk about the human condition, which really refers to the human being's place in a world that we have made and that is in return making us. This book is famous for focusing on the life of activity, sometimes called the Vita Activa. This is a life of doing things. Typically, the life of activity is contrasted with the life of contemplation. Philosophers for a very long time have valued the life of contemplation more than the life of activity, and Arendt says that because of that, the life of activity has been neglected and thus it's poorly understood. So she wrote an entire book about the life of activity. And she divides it into three parts: labor, work, and action. Labor is essentially the activities that we do to sustain life and to sustain consumption, while work is more about building and fabricating and actually constructing that world around us. Action is a particular kind of activity that takes place between human beings, where we get to disclose who we are. We get to sort of reveal our identities to each other without the intermediary of some other object. It is where we are coming to grips with our plurality, Arendt says, which is just the fact that we are people who live amongst other people. There is a clear hierarchy of value here. At the top is action, and then there's work, and then there's labor. While labor is necessary in order to sustain life, we don't want our world to be dominated by labor. We don't want our social realm to only be about the sustaining of life and also consumption. But that's precisely what's happened as we've become obsessed with consumption. If you live in a consumeristic society, well, then you live in a world that is going to value labor above all else. So this is an inversion of values that Arendt is concerned about, and she wants to sort of give work, and especially action, its proper place in our lives again. Arendt says that a life without speech and action is literally dead to the world. So if we want to live lives amongst other people, we need to have a life of action as well. And she also says that our full experience of action is what restores faith and hope in the world itself. It is what makes us feel like life is worth continuing and living in this world that we've built. Arendt has become a much more important thinker for me in the last couple of years. She was someone I never read when I was in graduate school, for instance, but when I started reading her independently, I found that she's really come to shape how I see the world. Of course, if we're not working all the time, what is it that we're supposed to be doing? Are we supposed to just be idle? And if you read this book from Bertrand Russell, the answer, it turns out, is yes. And that's this book called In Praise of Idleness. Russell's book is an essay against work. It's not an essay about being lazy or doing nothing, but it is precisely about this problem where we have let work come to dominate our lives. What Russell says is that work is necessary, that we do need to work, and that in some limited sense, work is good. But work is not the only source of value in our lives, but in our productivity-obsessed world, work is where we go to find meaning. But Russell says, no, let's all work some, but no one work too much. We'll make sure that everyone's needs are met, and we'll continue to work because that's how we can ensure that world comes about. But let's ask ourselves, what is it that we'd prefer to be doing with our time? What are those more valuable activities? This is what Russell means when he talks about idleness. It's similar to what people like Joseph Pieper have meant by leisure, where leisure is actually a time of doing quite a bit of stuff. It's where you can do your real thinking, for instance. And in Russell's idle time, this is when you get to pursue art or philosophy, or even just spend your time amongst friends and family. In Praise of Idleness really is more of an essay. The book is called In Praise of Idleness, but the first chapter is called In Praise of Idleness. And the rest of the essays in this book are good, but they're not as good as the title essay. However, the second chapter of the book is worth reading as a complement to the first. And that's where Russell gives his defense of useless knowledge. Because Russell points out that learning things, dedicating yourself to your education, actually just makes the world more pleasant. He has this great quote here: "Curious learning not only makes unpleasant things less unpleasant, but also makes pleasant things more pleasant." He talks about how he's enjoyed fruit more once he's learned about the history of agriculture and cultivation going all the way back to the Han Dynasty. And I think, in general, learning more about the world makes it a more interesting and wonderful place to be in. Curiosity, it turns out, isn't just a way to have some fun while you're learning. It goes on and just makes life better and better. So that useless knowledge that many of you might like to acquire, it's actually helping you to live at least a more enjoyable life. This theme that being useless, or you might even say inactive, actually makes your life better is a theme that's been explored in a number of works by Byung-Chul Han, and in particular this book, Vita Contemplativa. Han's probably more famous for his book, The Burnout Society, but really he's developing these thoughts in a number of basically pamphlet-sized books, keeps circling around the same topics over and over again. This book is a defense of inactivity, or the life of leisure and the life of the mind. Han refers to leisure and inactivity as an intense and radiant form of life, and it's a way for us to break out of what he calls an achievement society in the burnout society. Han describes in one of those books that we carry like a little labor camp inside all of us, always telling ourselves to work more. And he says in this recent book that we view inactivity as a deficiency. It is something that needs to be made up for as quickly as possible. When we're doing nothing, or especially when we're not working, we refer to it sometimes as killing time. It's literally dead time, he says. But he thinks that when we are inactive and leisurely and contemplative, that is when we are actually at our most truly alive. So the big question we're left with is, how do we change our lives to make room for this and to account for this fact? There's a long tradition of people writing books on this exact topic. There's Russell and there's Han. You can go all the way back to Essays in Idleness. If you looked at Henry David Thoreau's Walden, one of the most important parts of that book is when he is calculating how much wage labor he needs to work per year in order to live the life that he wants to live. So he knows he needs to work for money. He knows he's going to have to work so that he can survive and, eat food. But he also knows that if he lets work take over his life, he won't be able to do any of the leisure activities or the intellectual activities that he'd like. So he just calculates, he runs the numbers, he budgets, and he figures out how much do I have to work in order to live so that then I can go and live the life that I would actually like to live. It's my favorite part of Walden. Work is useful then not because it's useful in itself, but because of what it lets us go and do. If we start to live to work rather than work to live, the result is exactly what Han describes. It's a pervasive sense of burnout. And that burnout is what we are trying to avoid. As you're living this more leisurely life, perhaps you're going to want to read some novels too, or some fiction. And let's take a look at one example of some of the best philosophical fiction there is. This is Ficciones by Jorge Louis Borges. I've used this phrase before on the channel of philosophical fiction. It'd be helpful to actually say what I mean by that. Philosophical fiction is just writing that uses the art of storytelling to explore philosophical themes, to ask philosophical questions, or to describe philosophical ideas. Another term for fiction that does this would be novels of ideas. Ficciones is one of the clear examples of this, though it's not a novel, it's a short story collection. Borges actually tells us that we are to read this like it is a description of books that have not been written. So each chapter is a description of some other book. The chapters are describing books. We can't go and read the originals, so what we have to do is settle for Borges' descriptions and distillations. It's a fun premise for a short story collection, but it also allows Borges to focus right in on what he thinks is the interesting idea that he'd like to explore. Let's look at one example from Ficciones. That's the story Talan Ukbar Orbis Tertius. This is a story about the discovery of a fictional country, a country that seems to make its way into various sources of knowledge, like an old encyclopedia. And in this country, it's actually part of a world where idealism is true. It's like the idealism of George Berkeley. On top of that, all of the inhabitants know that. So how they talk about the world and how they use language shifts. It doesn't presuppose the realism that our language seems to presuppose. And this world is being described in a series of encyclopedia volumes, and those volumes are being written by members of a secret society, it turns out. And Berkeley, it turns out, was one of the members of that society. And if you're worried that I'm spoiling this for you, I would say Borges really isn't a writer who can be spoiled. It's the playfulness of the language, for one, that makes him worth reading, but two, just describing to you the ideas or the little beats that you'll find in the story doesn't reveal the depths of what he's trying to show, even in 5 or 6 pages. So in this story, we are getting a description of what if idealism were true. So what if this abstract metaphysical theory, a theory that some of us might understand, but few of us really think through, what if it were true? What would it mean for everyday life? That's what Borges is trying to show in just one of these stories. And it also shows that the writers of the encyclopedia, as they try to engage in what is essentially a prolonged act of make-believe, they end up doing philosophy as well. One of them even proposes that pantheism is true, which is something more similar to what Spinoza would argue rather than Berkeley. So it shows that they are working through the philosophical ramifications of their initial premise as well. So these stories can gently introduce you to big philosophical ideas while also telling you a good story, and he can do it in 15 pages in a way that makes you feel like you've read an entire book. Every story in Ficciones is a delight, and it always bends your mind in a way, and it always makes you look at the world slightly differently, which is what all of the books I've tried to mention in this video have in common. All of them can slightly reshape how you view the world. And that, I would say, is the real value of reading fiction, or especially spending your time reading philosophy.